Hello and welcome. It's Monday, so I thought we'd look at some beautiful Fendi to get inspired for some pattern cutting. And if you may be having a slightly boring or annoying Monday, then hopefully it will distract you a bit and give you some nice ideas for your next sewing project. If you haven't met, I'm Charlotte. I'm a pattern cutter and fashion designer, and I'm really passionate about teaching people to make their own clothes exactly to their own styles, whether it's designing, pattern cutting, fitting or sewing. You're in the right place. And what we're going to do in this video, look at the recent Fendi collection in Milan and look at the details you might want to incorporate in your next sewing project, but also talk about all the fabrics, the details, the constructions which make beautiful clothes, but which you can also again use in your own projects. And hello Suzanne, lovely to have you. And good morning to, I think it's already afternoon where you are. So this was a really nice collection. It was the first collection of Maria Carta-Chiori, who of course ran Dior for quite a few years, and she's now moved over to Fendi. So I want to quickly go through them, and then I'm going to flip over to my table and analyze them and talk about how you can use details from this collection, which had lots of really nice variable details, in your own pattern cutting and sewing. So we're going to talk about pattern hacking, about construction, how you can adapt it for your own projects. So what we had was quite a lot of jackets, and if you looking for new jackets, this is a good collection to look at. And what they did is very much putting the same style on men and women, but of course it's slightly differently pattern cut. So you end up with a similar look, but the pattern cutting behind it would be a bit different. And what I always find quite interesting, that of course these are very similar body types. They're both models. It would always be quite interesting to see when the same jacket again on somebody with maybe a fuller bust, or again a man with a different body type, and then really see how you, with different pattern cutting and fitting you have to do to create this look on different body types. And I think that's always there. Of course, fashion shows don't really yet tell you how it will look for yourself, but they had lots of a sort of slightly loose, relaxed, but not oversized silhouette for jackets, which are quite nice. So do have a look at that if you're interested. Oh, and hello Margaret, lovely to have you as well. But what I really wanted to talk about was the treatment of lace, because this collection was full of really variable lace. So you had some sort of more extravagant lace, like on this bias. Oh, and hello Deborah, and Deborah saying she's loving the jackets. Yeah, they're really nice and simple. So this collection was all about sort of variability and having a wardrobe full of sables. This is a jacket, so really worth looking at. And the same is for lace, because there's lace everywhere at the moment, but quite often lace is sort of quite, it is lace. It's so see-through, it's quite evening or underwear, but she did lots of lace, both more what we think of lace like on this bias cut, but which is an incredibly clever cut because it's got shaping, but the shaping is done through a lace paneling. So it's a really classic bias cut method for lace. So she did more classic lace like that, but then she also did lots of really variable lace ideas, like the inserts like that. So you've got a really nice insert into your blouse, quite vintage. I think, I always think it's of 1920s, 30s, they did lots of lace like that, and then it's repeated in the collar. So lots of ideas you can incorporate in your own wardrobe. We had some really over the top, again quite 1920s, 30s style with a lace insert, but again you could scale that down and use it in your own pattern cutting. Again, the trend seems to be that you have your underwear showing this season, which I probably won't be doing, but on here it's sort of done quite nicely. Again, I think that dress would have maybe even looked more beautiful with just a skin colored slip underneath, but that's just my opinion. You had lots of more of a sort of geometric stuff, again underwear showing through, but a really nice treatment of lace. And again, if you did that with a skin colored or contrast colored fabric underneath, then it's just got quite a nice unusual way of treating lace rather than it being sort of underwear inspired. It's more like 1920s, 30s inspired. And they did the same dress in a very special, I think it's a leather. And if I zoom in for a second, I can just show you it's exactly the same silhouette, which works really well, I think, with these sort of styles, with sort of really over top styles, and a really nice way of adding volume. So that's one of the things we're going to look in detail in a second. I really like this lace insert. It's not really lace, but it's a sort of see-through insert, but done not the usual way, you think. And then the last things I really liked was there was lots of sort of quite nice pattern cutting, again going with a geometric look we saw earlier on this dress, but adding a cape on it. So it has, I think it had a really 1930s feel. Be interesting what you think, whether I'm right about that. One thing I didn't like, and we had it at Dior quite a lot, and I think it's really practical. I can see that going everywhere. It's sort of longer shorts. And these are like pure 1990s cargo shorts, so even have the pockets. And maybe I just sort of saw them too much when I was a teenager. But yeah, so we saw them, J.W. Anderson did them quite a lot of Dior last season, I think. But it's sort of, again, I guess it's really practical. It's sort of thing you can actually see wearing. You know, people wear it out. You know, I've got shorts as well. But I sort of think it didn't quite fit into the collection. But of course, it is a real wardrobe stable, so I do get it. So this was the run through, and now let's have a look at some details you can use in your own wardrobe. And I'm going to look at inserts like that first, because they're really good pattern cutting projects. And this video is more about getting ideas and quite quick things you can add to an existing sewing pattern. But of course, if you want to learn how to design and draft your own clothes, then my pattern cutting membership closes in 6 hours. So if you'd like to join me, do have a look in the description. And it's a place where you can really learn everything you need, whether you're a beginner or more advanced, to design, draft, fit and make the clothes you want to wear every day. So if you'd like to join me, I would love to have you, of course. And that's also where we can go in more in depth into your personal projects and help you make the clothes. So let's have a look at how you could adapt and pattern hack the lace styles from this collection. So I'm going to slightly make this smaller. And there's so much lace this season, so I'm sort of thinking, I can imagine it becoming a trend, like staying. I quite like how lace is treated here, because it has sort of a bit of vintage, but it's also really wearable. You can imagine for lots of different sort of styles. And you can also mention with different fabrics. Let me get some pens. This Fendi blouse is a really good quick pattern hacking idea. What you can do is basically use any sewing pattern you have or your own block and make it a shirt. And of course, you don't have to make it a shirt. You could also use it as a blouse. But what basically happens is that you decide where you want your inserts to be. So they're lace inserts, and I think what they have done is they sort of gone through the bust point more or less. So I think it's of half a shoulder, and then it's of going through the bust point, and then of course exactly the same here. So it has quite maybe Edwardian even, but definitely sort of 1920s feel. And then what they've basically done, this whole section is replaced this lace, but then of course what we have, if we have a button stand, that helps sort of hold it in place and anchor it. And then what I might also consider, we can't really see it there, is whether you have, if you have a collar like this, you would then do your collar stand out of the real fabric again to hold it in place, because otherwise you need to somehow edge that lace. But it's a really easy way of adding lace to it. And of course, you could either make it complete lace, or you could back it in something. And if you back it in something, it makes it a little bit more stable, which is much easier to work with. And what you would do on your pattern, so whether that's a bad drawing, whether it's a sewing pattern or you're on block, you just decide where you want your cut to be. And then this gets replaced. So you would have here, you put a few notches in, and you just have a seam there, and you end up with 2 pieces. And I've done the whole shoulder just now, but of course that's completely up to you whether we do a whole shoulder or a half shoulder. I would probably do a half shoulder because that is a little bit more stable again. And then I would keep the back of it, I would keep the back completely plain, because that will again hold the lace in. Because if you ever worked for lace, depending on what lace you work on, it can be really unstable. What you can do, if the lace is too thin, you back it with a chiffon. So you can either just use the lace, or if it's a really fine lace, you might want to back it with a chiffon or an organza, or even an organdy. And that will sort of stabilize it. So that's what we call flatlining or mounting. So you literally cut out 2 pairs, one in lace and one in your mounting fabric, and you just stitch into the seam allowance to mount it together. If you have sort of a lace which is maybe really thin but then has like quite big lace bits on it, you might want to hand stitch some of them again to hold it in place. But then you can just treat it as normal. In this case, it's just stitched with normal seams. If you of course wanted to make it special, you could use lots of different hand stitching technique. I went through my books to hopefully show you some. Yeah, so if you want to hand stitch it, you can see here, this is the fantastic book by Claire Schaffer, Couture Sewing Techniques, and she includes quite a lot of images, which is good. But you can see this is hand stitched here, so you get the edge of the lace as such. If you want to have a quicker solution, you can also machine stitch it, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. And again, I have got some images and many books. So again, what you can do if you machine stitch it, you can stitch it like that, for example. Then you would fold it over, and then you can either hand stitch it or machine stitch it. I think they have done actually a different version. Let me see. And I would just experiment with it, to tell you the truth. Can you see how I've done it here? I'll hold it up a little bit. How I've stitched the lace on like that, and then they turned it over like this. So I can imagine it being like that. But you can't quite see with the detail. But it looks like it's a really straight edge, which most likely will mean it's machine worked. And Deborah is asking, what did they do to the collar? It's a top collar in lace and the under collar in the blouse fabric. Where would the interfacing go in? Yeah, so I think with the collar, because if you just cut, actually let's zoom in for a second. And this is always where it becomes quite interesting, because you also have to use your understanding of construction to do. Looking at it, it's definitely got the under collar in non-lace, in the silk fabric. And let me get my other pen. So if the under collar, as Deborah says, that would be in the silk fabric. And then you definitely have your layer on top, which is the lace. So you've got a lace layer. But as Deborah pointed out, if that happens, you can't interface the collar, and also your seam allowance would really show. So what I think is that they've cut the whole collar out of the silk, so 2 layers, And then you could also add a thin interfacing in between. And then again, they've just mounted the lace onto the top collar in silk. And then all the seam allowances are encased in between the two silk layers. And this looks a really floppy collar, so it could even be that it hasn't got interfacing. This is always what you sort of have to make a sample. Like a very lightweight interfacing will always improve things, but sometimes some silk blouse construction I've seen, they actually omit the interfacing because it makes it sort of more relaxed. Either one would work really well. And it's all about the type of lace you use for all of these. So you can get sort of laces with a net base, and you can get laces which are thicker. And I just remembered I might have a sample. Sorry, I've got, there we are, that's, so this is some very expensive lace, Swiss. So this lace, you can get it from anywhere. Anything from Switzerland will cost a fortune, but it's quite beautiful. So these are mostly embroidery and glass, but can you see a lace like that is it's basically a tulle or netting fabric, and then they've have embroidery on top of that, which will work really well with stuff like that because it's got more of a base. These are all embroidery and glass. Let's see if I had one more, but I might not have it anymore. No. Oh, stuff like that. That's all. So this is actually an embroidery and glass. But can you see, if you use stuff like that, I would then mount that on a chiffon or an organdy, because it is actually relatively stable, but it's mostly embroidery. So in between the embroidery bits, if you stitch it to there, it can become a bit sort of unstable. And it sort of might not want to sit very straight. So if you mount that onto a different fabric, that will definitely help with styles like that. Have a look, we've got another one. Thing is, you normally you get rid of most of your samples after a while, but I kept those ones because they're so beautiful. But at the other end, you could of course use vintage lace as well. Again, if you have a look at this one, I got, oh my god, something like that. So this is actually a trim, but you could imagine using something like that for that panel. So that would give you more of a vintage style. It might be, is it called Spanish lace? I'm never quite sure. Some of you in the chat might know more. But again, with something like that, I would mount that onto a organza or a chiffon, just so it's stabilized where you have the big holes. Which is why if you use a machine-made lace, which is basically where it's mounted onto some sort of netting or something, that is easier to work with rather than what a big lace like that where you have lots of holes. And these can be really heavy as well. I mean, I would actually mount it and then sort of hand stitch in a few places just to hold it in place. But that will very much depend on the lace, and you will, experiment, make a few samples to see how it works. In general, if you use a sort of machine-made lace with some sort of base, that can be a little bit easier because this will be more like a fabric. Can you see? That's quite stable. And you can easily just stitch it. You have to be a bit careful because, of course, it's a net, but you can see how you could get a really nice edge there. As soon as you move more into an embroidery and glass, something like that still be fine to be edged or stitched. But as soon as you get really big holes as such, negative things, then it gets harder to get a really nice neat edge. So that's something to consider when you're choosing your lace. But of course, you don't have to use lace. You could use an embroidered fabric, anything else. But it's a really quick, fun way of adding detail to any existing sewing pattern or your blocks. What you can also do, this is done on a really oversized cut, if you're fuller busted and you want to keep your bust out, or if you want to keep your bust out in general, you can actually use the lace point to do your pattern cutting as well, because this goes exactly through your bust point, so more or less. So you can cut this through your bust point, and then of course you can just close your darts and get rid of your bust point as well. So it's a way of, you can use it as purely as an insert, but as always, when you have a line going through your bust point, you can use it as your princess line as such, and do all your shaping through there as well, which is really nice. Okay, let's have a look at the other lace. So let's have a look at some other inserts. So this insert is a little bit more over the top, but it works exactly the same with the little strips. I'm going to zoom in for a second, but you can see where they've done what I would call a traditional sort of lace technique, where you would, if you get a fabric and it looks like it's either done with lace trim or lace fabric, you can use it with either. But what you would do is, I'm just going to try to find a contrast colored lace I can lay on top. One thing to can always consider when you, with your lace, is that you it's a elastic lace. So this is, for example, oh, this is quite stable. Let me try to find actually what I'm talking about, because what you can get is what I call sort of underwear lace. Oh, this is a perfect example. This is underwear lace, so this is stretchy. So I wouldn't want to use something like that, because this might stretches your stitch, it might distort, you know, all these sort of things. This is a machine-made lace, but it's relatively stable, so something like that would be fine to use on a fabric like that. And the great thing about, of course, about using trims rather than lace fabric, you can often get more choice, maybe a cheaper price as well. But what you would do is the way I think I've worked it. So again, you would decide, I'm going to move her out of the way a bit. So if we move it here, this is a lot more over the top, but what it basically is again, it's in this case it's a dress, and this time the thing is quite hard to see because there's quite oversized styles and they're done on really straight figures, so you can't really tell whether there's any shaping. But of course, that is the great thing about making your own, is that you can do your shaping. But what we have is more a sort of fitted dress. And I'm going to concentrate on the bodice, but the sleeve work exactly the same. And what they've basically done is they've sort of done, again, very sort of vintage silhouette, where you have these inserts, and I think they do the shaping as well. And you can't actually have drawn it wrong, sorry. I'm going to start again, rather than trying to rescue it. So what we have is basically the dress like that, and I think it is quite fitted. So I think if for most shapes I would want to have my shaping there, which way I don't think they've done it, but you could incorporate it. I'm going to show it to you. This is quite complicated just because we're having strips. However, the way you can basically work it, if you wanted to, is rather than having really narrow pattern pieces, because you can see if you cut this into pattern pieces, they'd be really narrow, wouldn't they? And I think they've used fabric rather than trim. I tell you why, because there's no seam here. If you use trim, you could do that, but you have a seam there, and of course it's quite shaped. So this is probably just done with lace fabric, but if you were happy to do just straight ones, you could easily use a trim. But then they've of course done the sort of ray shapes, and this is one of those where you can do a version of it quite straightforward. To do exactly like that is probably, well, it is very highly skilled. But if you, so for example, this is, I know I've left off a ray, I ran out of style and I can't see where it's going, but there's basically a third ray somewhere. If you wanted to do a more straightforward version, for example, what you might do is that you do a blouse or a top or whatever you want to do, and you could just have one running down there, or for example you could have a few sort of going like this. But what you do if you make it purely ornamental, you lay your lace on, and then in this exactly the same color, you can lay it on top or underneath. But what you basically do is you do a very fine zigzag stick, and you zigzag the two of them together, and then you trim it off. That's one way of doing it. The other way is this way, and we can do it by hand or not. Where again you stitch it on in place, and then you open it up, and then you fold it over, and then again you can do it by machine or you can do a zigzag stitch. But that's way of sort of mounting either way. You would literally lay your I think it's a chiffon on top of your lace, and then you would stitch all these shapes. So the theory of it is quite straightforward. The tricky bit is working with 2 layers of fabric, getting it completely flat. And you can see even here, you know how it's a little bit wobbly? If you're not careful and you haven't done this before, it would become incredibly wobbly. The other way is to actually have separate pattern pieces for each of these, which would make it easier with one hand, but it would have really narrow pattern pieces. And again, it's just very tricky to construct. So I would only recommend doing this if you really want a big project or you love really tricky things like that. And I would do a lot of samples to practice it. And the trickiness is the lengths of it, because it has to be perfect all the way. And the narrow strips in between, if you ever done something like that, you know that if you get anything wrong, it starts twisting, it starts basically misbehaving. So again, it's a big piece like that, you could work on it with like a really thin piece of paper, or you know, the sort of paper you can, like a woven paper, you can pull away afterwards. So you could mount everything on paper and stitch with a paper layer underneath, which would stabilize it. But again, it's the size of it which makes it quite a hard project at home. But something like that is a much more straightforward interpretation. Of course, you could have, you know, you can, if you use, for example, cotton fabric, or instead of using a chiffon, if you use an organdy, which is a cotton see-through fabric, it's a lot more stable. And then you could still, like, you could have these sort of effects going where you want them. You know, you could play around with it, but it's a lot more stable, and it's a smaller piece rather than a really big piece, which makes all the difference. And Deborah is asking about the sleeve, because she says it's very nice, but the volume is different, and you're completely right. So let's have a look with sleeve. I think with this sleeve, the lace is purely ornamental. I'm going to zoom in because I can see it looks like a bishop sleeve, but there's something happening at the cuff. But what they might actually, again, this is where it gets, you would have to really see how the dress looks in the shop. But what it looks like is, and that's where you can have fun if you, rather than mounting it, if you actually treat each one as a pattern piece. So what it actually looks like is that it's quite a close fitting piece up here, and you got the insert there, and then you got your insert here. And then it looks, and we got another insert there. And then it looks like, I think they've only added the volume here. And that is a great thing. What you can do with pattern cuttings like that is that you, if you make it as different pattern pieces, you just add the volume where you want to be. So if that's your sleeve, and again, that'd be really nice for a cotton shirt, a silk dress like that, it works for everything. But what you basically do is you, let me draw on the pattern pieces first. You basically draw on your pattern pieces, which is something like that. Again, I'm sort of slightly guessing because I can't see the... So these are your pattern pieces. So you could do it like that, and if you did it like that, all you then would do is you do slash lines here, here, all the way down. And then you also slash it, for example, along this line, or maybe a little bit lower as well. And then you open them all up so it becomes much wider. So it becomes like you've got lots of volume going like this, lots of extra volume, like an Easter egg. So all of this is extra, the blue one, and that gives you the volume. So that's a really nice way of, rather than, you know, normally a bishop sleeve is always either like this or it has a seam to get the volume. This is basically the panels are used to decide where you want to add the volume, and then the rest is like a bishop sleeve construction, but it's much more controlled. And then of course you could do that, and then what you could do is you could add your inserts. So what you could even do is that, to make it easier, the inserts, that you say this is my separate pattern piece here, for example, and then you just add the lace to the edge, and then you could actually stitch it together, and then afterwards you trim the fabric underneath or off. So that'd be a much easier way of doing it. But that's always, but I actually love these videos, because you can look at lots of books, but they only give you the examples. And ultimately, you only learn a lot of things by analysing, by looking at real garments, and also by sort of working up, by talking it through, like Deborah asked the questions about where the volume comes from. And then you suddenly think, oh yes, if I just had the pattern piece like that, and then I mount my lace on at the edge, I can then stitch it to each of my different pattern pieces. And again, they only have the lace at the edge, and I can leave the fabric underneath even attached to it. And of course you do that one first. But you can sort of see how that would be a much easier construction, wouldn't it? Rather than it being having to sort of insert the lace. And this is why I do this drawing. I've always done it when I worked full-time as a fashion designer. I used to draw all things out when I used the pattern cutter for other people. They gave me sketches, and when I used to draw it again and again, to trying to work out and really think and look at what I know about construction, going through it. But as you draw it, your brain sort of kicks in, and the memory of stuff you've seen comes up. So it is quite an organic concept, but it really helps. And, you know, I'm not the best drawer, but it's for yourself. You work it out, you know. I've never seen a pattern look like that, but I can tell it's a bodice, and it helps me work out where I would put it. And I would probably do something like that. And you could do it for the whole dress as well. And that way you get bigger pattern pieces, and you sort of piece it together bit by bit. And it's a lot neater. So I would literally probably, this is a thin zigzag stitch. You would sort of stitch it on like that. You stitch it on like that. Then here you probably just have like a running stitch to hold it in place. And then you put it together, and again do a zigzag stitch to hold it all together. But that'd be really neat and much easier. Oh, and Deborah is going to try. Please do it. I think over the dress is quite over the top, but I think that sleeve would be a really nice addition. But actually I think that this whole the top, I think it could make a really nice 1930s top. And I do love these sort of Art Deco. I think it's quite Art Deco. Ray is sort of quite a beautiful style, but I have done styles like that in organdy, and it is just very hard, and organdy is a lot more stable with chiffon, so I wouldn't want to try it. But I think as a top it'd be easier, because it's about the size as well. Like, you know, none of us have a massive studio or workroom. You know, some of you might, but in general, you know, when you look at these big ateliers, they have massive tables. Your factories are even more like that they have the massive tables. You can lay it out, you can work completely flat, and it's also done for 10 hours a day, rather than, you know, you having to then get on with the rest of your life. So it's a little bit easier. So breaking it down and just using one impact makes it a lot more approachable. And also this would be really nice without the trim. A sleeve like that on a top, isn't it? It'd be a real statement sleeve, but I like how it's fitted at the top, like that. So, and this beautiful lace style, that's it for me today. You can see there's lots of idea and you can interpret it. And one thing, if you are on my pattern cutting school, and I know a few of you are, if you want to do a style like that, where it's a geometric fitted style and the lines don't run through the bust point, but they run anywhere on the body, there's a tutorial for it, and I will put it on our community with a link to that, because it's a really nice, again, it's very Art Deco, very 1920s to 30s, of creating really interesting style lines which don't have to go to the bust point. You will always have to do something to the bust point, of course, to make it fit, but it moves the point of interest, the style line or the design lines, away from the bust and gives you really interesting ways of doing it. And of course, it can be underneath the bust like this, it can be above, it can be anywhere you want, but it's a really nice way of designing your own styles and playing with your darts you have in an unusual way. So do have a look at the community. I will put it up in a second. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really nice collection, and I love this real variability of lace. Rather than, I mean, looking at the Chanel recently, the haute couture still, it sort of becomes a bit like, yes, there's a lot of underwear here as well, that seems to be a trend, but I like how Maria Grazia Chiara made the lace really variable as well, with the inserts, and also how there's lots of details you can interpret it for your own style and add to your existing sewing patterns or existing patterns you drafted yourself, which always makes it really nice. If you have a detail which can transform something you already have, you don't have to fit it again, you know, you don't have to cut it all out again. You can literally just trace through the part you want to add details on, and then use the rest of your pattern, and you already know how your pattern works and how it's stitched, so you don't have to work through a whole load of construction only for the panels where you're adding it. And you would literally add that first, and then you just do the rest of the construction exactly as before. So it's really relatively straightforward detail to add, and it will look amazing because lace always looks great. And also because there's quite small amounts of lace, it's a relatively affordable project rather than making a whole lace dress, which can be really expensive. I'd love to know, of course, from you in the comments, if you're watching recordings, what do you think of the Fendi collection? Do you like anything? Is there anything I missed as well? Do let me know. And I'll be back on Wednesday with either Gucci or Prada. Neither were that great. One was decidedly worse than the others. So we had our high point for this week. It's sort of going to go a little bit lower. But for both of them, there were a few details I really liked. And the Prada especially had the perfect 10-minute pattern hacking project. Again, 1920s, 30s. So that sort of might be what we've been seeing lots of that style. So it's a beautiful period of history. So it'll be fun to interpret that more often. But that's it for me for today. Thank you so much for joining me, everybody. Bye, Robin and Deborah. And oh, we got Dane as well. Lovely. And bye-bye, Margaret. And bye-bye.